So this is an old project. In fact, this was the very first piece of large terrain that I ever built. A lot of the footage is missing, a lot of it was already corrupted, but I found some of it was actually salvageable, and I found myself in an odd position, a bit amazed at my past self. In my opinion, there are some fundamentals to designing ruins for your tabletop terrain that are rarely talked about, and they revolve around a couple of key points, which we're going to discuss today. Minis on bases will necessarily expand the footprint of a piece of terrain. A grander story will need to be told by the terrain using nonverbal cues. And 3, the terrain for a war game or a skirmish game has to favor both the attacker and defender, but not necessarily in the ways you might think. So we're going to walk through each one of these points. But first, hey, if you like these videos and you want to see more of these old footage of these never before posted terrain builds, drop a like and leave a comment below. So let's talk about the minis issue. Stairs are a chronic problem because you want your minis, which is what a majority of this type of terrain building will be for, to be able to freestand without having to need to use some sort of extra bit like tack or a supporting stand to keep them on a step. This results in steps that are going to be massively deformed. After all, a regular stair in most locations across the world are half, 3/4 of a normal human foot, or even smaller, grand staircases notwithstanding, of course. In this particular case, I had to make a concession. Since this is a ruined fort, I figured the steps would be heavily eroded and broken up, thus explaining why you can put a whole mini on a base on top of the step. This serves the function of telling the story I had in mind, but also it hides the lack of the other steps that should be there, that if one were to look at it logically, you would have to have. It shows enough of the steps and suggests the idea of steps in such a way that your brain reads it as logical. But in this case, time and tides have conspired against these steps, and we are only left with, oh no, platforms. And it culminates with the lowest step of this particular build, when it hits that central platform, being almost entirely removed. Likewise, the play space for the miniatures needs to be considered overall, but not necessarily to the greatest extent. A dramatic battle against a large monster in a narrow hallway can be just as cinematic as one in an open field. This will slide into our second point pretty nicely. Nonverbal cues can be worked into the terrain itself. Here I elected to use the nature of the walls themselves and the type of damage that's been done to this structure to tell something of a story. The damage to these steps might suggest that a great force has been used, while the scattering of small stones outside of the built-up area suggests that there was once a much larger structure here. The position of the walls then will serve to guide the eyes, if you will, and implies to the players of whatever game this is, there's a way to move organically through this terrain that the original architect intended. The upper stairs is constructed in such a way to confer and suggest that another story of this building once existed, and that this part has effectively completely collapsed. This is the art of nonverbal storytelling within a terrain piece. On the tabletop, this is going to give the players just as much information as you, the DM, will be able to give them describing it. As a natural consequence of these things, you're going to want to endeavor to at least build the terrain in such a way that it appears to be fair in the game mechanics it's intended for. There needs to be factors that will support both an attacker and a defender and confer advantages and disadvantages. Here, there's the use of choke points, elevated platforms that allow one group or another to control the flow of the battle. And you have to very carefully consider how you want the players to interact with it. If you're building this for a wargaming or an RPG setting, then you've got to consider these types of things and not simply scatter things across for the sake of having it look visually interesting. This can be combined, but it's going to take a steady hand and a vision and an intentionality to it. Consider the stone walls that block the site from the interior along the step side and the inner wall from the platform out towards the lone pillar on that little broken segment. These create blind spots. These blind spots can be used as approaches by your PCs. They can also be somewhat negated by utilizing the vantage point on the upper landing of the stairs. This is a way of encouraging your players to start to think much more tactically with the advantages of high ground versus blind spots. And there we have it. This is just some of my ideas about some of the fundamentals of building an RPG / skirmish wargaming terrain piece that fits the subject that it's meant for rather than being an art piece. As I've gotten better at crafting these types of things, I've been able to introduce more and more of these artistic elements into practical terrain. But like any skill in life, it just takes time and effort to be able to integrate it. The third point about advantages and disadvantages can be played with, and I see that as very much more the more loose rules, fundamentals, if you will. But hey, you know what? Just keep crafting regardless of what your thoughts on this, and you'll produce pieces that you love to use for gaming. Some will end up being solely for gaming, some will be pieces of art, like the Nightmare Tower. It's a ridiculously impractical piece when it comes to skirmish wargaming, worthless when it comes to wargaming, but it's oversized and it's more of an art piece and a story being told of this abandoned tower that stands alone. Why not check out that video on the creation process? I'm sure you'll understand why I say that. So remember to like and subscribe if you like what I do here. Leave a comment if you think I'm way off the mark. And let's start a conversation about